Professor Gold, Dr. Schaefer, thank you so much for wanting to do this follow-up Q&A with us. We have 10 questions in total. Going to start with the first question. This is also kind of a comment. It sounds like auditors think that audit fees and audit hours are issues contained between management and the auditors. Is it that they don't want to get the audit committee involved in this? Or is it that they don't realize that they could get audit committee support for this?
So we didn't ask this specific question, so we don't really know an exact answer. But what we do notice is that a small percentage of our respondents actually bring this up as a potential way of providing support. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they think fees and audit hours are issues for management only versus the audit committee, or even that they wouldn't go to the audit committee in case of any kind of problems. But I think what we can say is that it doesn't seem to be top of mind when they think about the word support, when we're asking them about that particular term.
So what do you think comes to mind when they do think about the word support?
So what we found when we were using that terminology was that they brought up things like openness and communications and support in terms of disagreements with management.
And providing insights, I think, was another one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We were a bit surprised about this ourselves, that they wouldn't bring this up more. That's what based on the literature, we would have expected they would bring up support in terms of fees and hours. But the data speaks for itself, I guess.
Well, that's quite interesting. So I have a second question. In the survey, in respect of the degree and type of audit committee support, did you know differences between the United States and Dutch respondents? And if so, what were those differences?
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to say that in this particular survey, we need to be very careful in drawing too many conclusions from any country differences, even if they are there. Because we didn't really work very hard on getting, fully representative samples. And our goal was also not to make this cross-country comparison. You would basically need a very different design for that and make sure they really match each other. And now we don't know if any differences are really caused by the country difference. And if so, what does that mean? So big disclaimer before I share any insights that we found here. And also, I would like to emphasize that we were actually quite lucky to get this fairly large sample by combining the two countries. So it was a little bit of a pragmatic approach also, because we had an entry point in the US, also in the Netherlands through the FAR, of course. So what we wanted to do primarily was maximize the number of respondents, and we did that by combining those two countries. And then the third thing I want to say is that we were primarily interested in the qualitative responses, where the goal is really more to get in-depth insights into the qualitative answers that they gave. So open questions about various issues related to audit committee support, rather than actually comparing across the two groups. All that said, we did notice a couple of differences, but really not very many, which to us was comforting because we were more interested in getting a homogeneous sample that we can draw more general conclusions from. But one difference that we saw was that U.S. auditors actually indicated a higher average percentage of supportive audit committees. So where the overall percentage, if you recall from the conference, was about 61%. This was highest for auditors from the US. This was at 68.6%. And in the Netherlands, this percentage was on average at 56%. So it's all, around that 60% mark, but it's slightly higher experience of supportive committees in the US compared to the Netherlands. Whatever that means, we'd have to dig deeper to really draw conclusions there. However, we also asked some closed questions about the level of, or the type of conveyance, if you recall. So we asked them, how is support being conveyed through the partner, through the audit committee chair, or not at all? And we have various percentages there. So most of them say it's conveyed through the partner or manager. There are some, about 13%, say through the audit committee chair, and 42% say they don't experience any conveyance of audit committee support. And here we see no significant differences between the two countries, which again to us is, I know the listeners might have hoped for some more exciting differences between the two countries, but for us, this is actually quite comforting because it means we have a sample where we can, pull those two countries together. And then we asked a final closed question, which was about the interaction at various levels in the audit team with the audit committee. So how much interaction does the partner have with the audit committee, the director, the seniors, the managers? And here we, again, didn't see any differences between countries except for the directors. So we see that proportionally more directors in the Netherlands, 80% actually interact with the audit committee compared to the US, where it's only 52%.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that says so much about this whole story about audit committee support. Maybe it says more about how teams are formed in the US versus the Netherlands. Maybe directors are more frequently part of the audit team in the Netherlands than they would be in the US. Maybe they have a more managing role in the US. I honestly don't know for sure, but to me, that finding is not that important, actually.
Okay, very elaborate. Thank you very much. So the third question is, can you elaborate on how auditors do not believe that audit committees have an influence on professional skepticism?
Yeah, this was an interesting result. So maybe if you recall, we had 45.3% that indicated this, that said that they don't feel that the audit committee has any impact on the professional skepticism of audit committees. There are a lot of potential explanations for this. We think maybe most driving might be the lack of conveyance of support. That percentage of 55% overlaps quite highly with the percentage of auditors that didn't experience any conveyance of support, and generally also seniors that simply do not interact at all with the audit committee. So that might be driving this lack of experience or lack of anticipated impact of audit committee support on professional skepticism. We also see, and this is mere speculation, but we see that quite a few auditors, especially in the US, mention that the audit committee is quite disconnected from what the audit team does. They're also oftentimes geographically far away. And again, especially in the US, where geographic distances are large. So oftentimes they're just not aware, they don't have the time, they're too busy to deal with those nitty-gritty issues of an audit. So that might also explain that auditors generally don't feel that they give much of support. Maybe, Tammie, you would like to add some points to this.
Yeah, we also noticed some things in the experiment side where we had quite a few individuals note in our open-ended response that audit committee support wouldn't influence skepticism because they're always appropriately skeptical. So they said that, that wouldn't matter in how they act or react to something because they're always going to do the right thing based on what they see, regardless of what the audit committee says. So I think that might be something. But then also, and I think this is probably one of the more interesting things is, we're not always aware of factors that influence our judgments and decision-making processes and the outcomes. So one of the reasons that we conduct experiments, in addition to doing the survey part, is because oftentimes these judgments or behaviors are influenced by things that we may not think would matter.
Yep.
But when you put people in a situation, sometimes they act differently than they think they would act.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that very clearly. So Tammie already mentioned that they wrote this down as part of the experiment. But also when I held the experiment, so during the sessions, I would typically have like a debrief afterwards and tell them what this whole study is about, and we'd have some discussion. And this is the signal I received many, many times. in this study, also in other studies, that they would kind of laugh and say, oh, but that shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter, rationally speaking. But they also believe it doesn't matter for their judgments. And that's quite interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have two questions kind of lumped together, so I'll ask them both back to back, and then you can see how you fill this in exactly. So in general, do you think whether or not the composition of an audit committee and the ensuing support depends on management attitude? And then similarly, how do you address the potential endogeneity due to a management with poor attitude influencing the appointment of audit committee members who are less likely to support professional skepticism by auditors?
So these are great questions. And while they're not directly in the scope of what we're looking at here, there is clearly evidence in the literature that despite independence regulations, there is involvement by management in the oversight of auditors.
Okay.
So it's possible that management teams with certain attitudes might be more or less likely to have supportive audit committees. But I don't think we can say what that looks like for sure based on the results of our study. One thing that we can note based on our current project is that communications about support to the audit team, especially when they're made by the partner, it seems to matter. So in our experimental condition where there's no support communicated and management has a bad attitude, that's where we see the least amount of skeptical action.
So what's the mechanism driving this, in your opinion?
Driving the impact of communication, I think probably the mechanism driving that would be that auditors feel like they're given that freedom to act on the red flags that they see. So they feel comfortable taking action.
Yeah, they feel protected. Yeah, feel protected maybe by the audit committee and don't have to anticipate the same level of pushback by management as they would if they didn't. That's kind of the broad underlying theory that we had in doing this study.
Yeah, and the differences that we noted being particularly important with the partner may also have to do with the direct supervision. So they have that, their partner may be the one signing off on their evaluation or whatever. The fact that it's maybe a little bit stronger when the partner communicates that may make them feel even more directly protected.
Which is quite understandable if you look at it from just an interpersonal perspective.
Right.
Yeah, especially for lower level auditors, which is actually the target in our experiment, the seniors, where from the survey we know they wouldn't actually be exposed to the audit committee. They probably might not even have a picture with that. What does that actually mean? Who's that person? Whereas, of course, the audit partner is a person that they're familiar with. And even though it's a fictional case, so in this particular case, they wouldn't have a face in front of them, but they would have a role model. And they would know what they're accountable to. And then maybe in the audit committee chair condition, that becomes a bit more blurred. And that's why the effectiveness there was not as high.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that makes sense. And I mean, this is also consistent with what we see generally in the literature about the importance of tone at the top.
Thank you very much. That's a very elaborate answer. The sixth question I have is, prior literature investigates the effect of client pressure on auditor professional judgment. What's the difference between management attitude and client pressure?
That's also a great question. And I think they're actually two entirely different constructs. So probably the biggest difference, in my opinion, would be that when you're talking about client pressure, that usually involves the client explicitly exerting some type of pressure on the auditor to reach a certain conclusion or to make a specific decision. But in our study, we purposefully held constant the timeliness and responsiveness of the client. So there wasn't any type of explicit pressure to do something. So it was only the attitude that was different. So in all of our conditions, management was not explicitly trying to get the auditor to reach a particular conclusion. And I think that's probably the most important difference between those two constructs.
Yeah, I think maybe to add to that, I fully agree. I think there are different constructs. One could argue maybe that they could be correlated. Maybe a more pushy management might come across as more aggressive towards the auditor. On the other hand, if they behave strategically, maybe they would be very accommodating, and use more sneaky ways to get their, their position
Yeah,
through.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think at some point when we developed the design, we thought about having a more extreme manipulation in the direction of client pressure rather than just management attitude, but we chose to go for the more subtle cues here.
And I think part of the reason that we were even more interested in this is because it shouldn't matter as a factor as much as maybe a more explicit manipulation. You might be able to argue that aggressive reporting is higher risk, and so it should matter.
Yeah.
Right.
In this case, we thought it would be interesting to see if just their attitude.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So here's one question from someone in the audience who wonders if the auditor-client negotiations play a role in your setting.
So this is also something that we can't speak directly to, but yes, the auditor-client negotiation would potentially play a role. And it would be something that would be really interesting as a future research topic. It's possible that we would see similar result as our experiment in that auditors may feel more comfortable taking a stronger stance on an issue if they felt supported.
Yep.
So if they were from a negotiation standpoint. But again, unfortunately, this isn't something that we can speak directly to based on what we did in this particular study because we didn't test it directly.
Yeah.
But I think it definitely could be the case.
Okay. Well, I understand it's very difficult to answer these more wide-ranging questions, I guess. If it's not specifically in the study, then you might have indications and you might have a gut feeling, but it's of course not very scientific to then give an answer that's not really based in the empiric. So I fully understand that it's difficult to answer this. The eighth question has to do with the frequency and timing and proactiveness of audit teams communicating with audit committees varies in practice. Does your research or experiment give any indications of what audit teams could do in ensuring audit committees' timely attention to create the best conditions to stimulate professional skepticism in the audit?
So this one is one I can speak directly to. So one of the takeaways from our experiment that we found quite interesting, and I mentioned before, was that the communications from the partner to the team were just as, or maybe even in some cases more effective than having those come from the audit committee chair. So we also found through our surveys and interviews that the audit committees can show their support by being open, involved, and sharing their insights with the audit team. Additionally, we had multiple individuals mention providing a reminder that the audit team is serving and protecting users of the financial statements. So that way it redirects their focus. So they're not focused on pleasing management, but focused on instead on protecting the users. So to the extent that these are things that could be communicated early and perhaps even regularly to the audit team, it seems like those communications might be quite impactful to the audit.
Okay.
And maybe to add to that, I mean, again, our study doesn't address that, but it's just something that I've thought about. Sometimes it may also be the case that the audit committee is not actually aware of the added value they can provide. I mean, we only surveyed the auditor side of this interaction, and well, that said, we actually did a very small scale survey at some point with some audit committee members that we may want to look at. It's just too few participants, but that's something that might provide some insights also. But what I want to get to is that maybe audit committee members are not always 100% sure how they can provide that support that would be perceived as useful by the audit teams. So some communication could probably be improved also in that direction towards the audit committee to give them an idea of how they could be helpful and supportive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting notion. Okay, so we've arrived at the ninth question. We're almost completely done with the follow-up Q&A. How about the differences between engagement partners and lower-level auditors? Does that affect your survey results in any way?
Yeah, it definitely affects the survey results. We see in the more quantitative questions or in the closed questions, we see that respective experience with audit committees and audit committee support varies a lot depending on the rank people have. So that, of course, in the survey explains why we get maybe the more insightful responses from managers and partners, because they are the ones that can base their responses actually on their own experiences. That said, I was a bit pleasantly surprised also by the insights that were given by people that might not have had experiences that much with audit committees, but still would have some suggestions on, how they could potentially provide support. Because we also asked, as you know, we asked some questions about best practices and perfect world solutions, and there we actually had some seniors that would provide some interesting insights too. But of course, again, because of their limited experience, they may not be able to base that really on their own experiences. And then, of course, maybe to add to that also, the experiment that we did was with those seniors that have limited experience. And this is where experiments are so useful, because you can actually test conditions on people that they would not be exposed to in the real world. That was kind of the idea, to look at a mechanism that may not yet be out there, but what if? And that's where experiments provide a great way of testing what would happen to people's minds and judgments if you expose them to such conditions.
Yeah.
And in that experiment, we also noted that the less experienced seniors, even within that population, they seem to be the most impacted by the partner communicating support.
Which is, I guess, in line with what you would expect going into an experiment like this.
Maybe they're most malleable because they haven't yet been influenced too much by their prior experiences.
Yeah. So we've arrived at the final question. How do your findings relate to the accountability literature? Isn't it possible that audit committee support reflects audit committee independence and reduces auditors' perceived accountability to the firm?
So again, we didn't ask that specifically, but yes, I think it's possible. And it kind of relates to the comment about reminding the team about their job in protecting users. It might be for some or many, support also reflect the audit committee independence and reduces this sense of accountability. But I would say that it seems like taken as a whole, it's a part, but maybe not all of what the auditors thought about when they were considering methods of audit committee support. So I think the accountability part is a piece of that greater puzzle that we've been working with, in that, we talked earlier about reminding the auditors that they're serving and protecting users. So that would be reminding them that they're accountable to those users rather than being accountable to management.
Yeah.
Which is going to change, their perceptions there. But what we talked about was more than that. It's more than just reminding them about the accountabilities. It's also support was the openness, the communications about, disagreements and the insights provided by the audit committee. I guess that's what I mean in that I think it's a piece of what we're seeing here, and it's definitely related to, but it may not be the full story.
Okay.
There's more to these communications than just the accountability aspect.
Yeah, and also more than, because what the person that asked the question also referred to independence and whether that could be replaced with what we manipulate. And it probably, again, like Tammie said, what we manipulate goes even beyond that. It's not only showing because a lot of studies have looked at that, the degree to which an audit committee is independent, whether that affects, auditors' decisions and judgments and risk assessments. So we kind of know that. But we want to see, well, okay, independence is almost kind of a given. Must be careful saying that because there are also studies that do show that even today, post SOX in the US and post other similar regulations in the rest of the world, that's still not necessarily always the case. But in form, at least, in the composition and in the level of expertise, audit committee members are highly knowledgeable and highly independent.
Yeah.
But beyond that, what can they actually do to improve the quality of audit? That's what we were interested in. So in that sense, it does go beyond that accountability and independence element.
Since we're also specifically looking at lower level auditors, I think that might even be more impactful because they may not have the same perceptions about independence, and they may not realize exactly what that may mean. Because they don't deal directly with
that's a good point.
Discussions.
Thank you both so much for wanting to do this follow-up Q&A. I wish you both the best of luck with all of the future research projects.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.